My name is Ethan Blake, and I've spent the last 19 years plumbing the ocean floor as a commercial diver, mostly off the coast of West Africa. At 49, my body carries the weight of 1,000 dives and 1,000 more missed birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet dinners. Every breath I've taken underwater was for my family, to build them something I never had growing up: stability. But all it took was one voicemail to collapse it all. The message came through just after I surfaced from a brutal 16-hour dive shift, the kind that makes your bones ache and your fingers wrinkle like old parchment. I still had salt in my beard and rust on my hands when I tapped play. Don't come home. I've filed for divorce. Everything we had, it's mine now. It was Danielle, my wife of 17 years, my partner in everything, or so I thought. Her voice was calm, confident, cold. I blinked, thinking maybe it was a bad connection, but another notification pinged right after. A screenshot of our joint account. The balance? $0.00. Where $186,000 had once been, Danielle added a winking emoji. I didn't throw my phone, didn't shout. I just sat on the edge of my bunk in our cramped rig quarters, the hum of the generator a steady rhythm in the background. I reread the messages once, then again. That woman had just erased nearly 2 decades of our life, like deleting an old contact from her phone. No explanation, no warning, just a clean, surgical removal. I wanted to believe there was more to it, that maybe this was some twisted joke or a mistake, but deep down, I'd seen the signs for months. The shorter phone calls, the growing distance in her voice, the excuses about money transfers. Just home repairs, she had said. Even the new Audi in the driveway when I was home last month. She claimed it was her sister's. It wasn't her sister's. Still, I went to bed that night with my steel-toed boots still on, staring at the bunk above me. I knew this was bigger than heartbreak. Danielle hadn't just left me, she'd declared war on everything I had built. And I wouldn't let that go unanswered.
Ethan didn't scream. He didn't punch steel walls or hurl his helmet into the sea. That's not the kind of man he was. His pain didn't explode. It compressed, hardened, like pressure building in the depths of the ocean where he worked. Instead, he stood up, wiped the grit from his hands, and typed a single message into his encrypted satellite messenger. Phase black light. No names, no emotion, just a code. On the other end of that message was Simon Reyes, a retired Navy JAG officer and Ethan's most trusted friend. 5 years earlier, over a bottle of bourbon and a conversation about failed marriages and vanishing pensions, Ethan had asked Simon to help him set up a blind trust, separate from Danielle, separate from the world. It was structured through 3 shell companies, held offshore and funded entirely through performance bonuses and contract sign-on fees. Danielle had never known. Within minutes, Simon replied, "Initiating protocols. Freeze complete. You're covered. Don't engage. Let me work." And just like that, Danielle's clean sweep wasn't so clean. Still, Ethan had 13 more days underwater, 13 more days of carrying a wrench that weighed more than his betrayal. He went about his work like nothing had changed, waking before dawn, inspecting valves, securing cables, guiding junior divers through routines that used to feel like second nature. But every time he surfaced, the air felt thinner, the world above water now foreign. Danielle hadn't just taken the money. She had sold their house, the one Ethan had paid off years before, brick by brick with his hands on weekends. She'd emptied the 401k, claimed it was for emergency upgrades when he first asked about the withdrawals months back. There had been a forged home equity loan, too. Brendan, Simon's accountant partner, traced it within 48 hours. Signed under Ethan's name, notarized by a shady friend of hers from yoga class. And then there was the lover, Lucas Crane, 28, a tech entrepreneur with no formal education, 3 LLCs, and 0 reported income. Ethan had never heard of him until Simon showed him Lucas's Instagram profile, photos of him posing in Ethan's old leather jacket, lounging in Ethan's living room, driving Ethan's truck. The captions were like knives, manifesting abundance. Some men build empires, others just inherit them. She deserves better. Ethan stared at the screen until his vision blurred, not from tears, but from fury. Lucas had moved into Ethan's life like a parasite, using Danielle as his host, and Danielle had made it easy. In the silence of the rig, as compressors hummed and blowout preventers roared, Ethan made a plan. He pulled out the hard drive Simon had sent him years ago, a security clone of all his assets, documentation, proof of transfers, and the original blind trust agreement. He stored it in the watertight case hidden beneath his bunk, next to an old Polaroid of him and Danielle from their early years. The photo felt like a lie now, her smile weaponized in hindsight. Every night after his shift, he skipped mess hall and sat instead at the far end of the deck, just him and the sea, reviewing financial records, tracing Danielle's moves, watching how she and Lucas had been draining accounts in increments designed to avoid detection. $4,500 here, $6,000 there, all under the radar. But Ethan had prepared for this. Years ago, after a coworker lost everything in a bitter divorce, Ethan promised himself one thing: no one will ever take what I built without a fight. And now, the fight had come to him. Simon was already coordinating with legal counsel in Texas to file injunctions on the house proceeds. Brendan was preparing a forensic audit report for court, and a sealed complaint was being drafted with evidence of financial fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Ethan, meanwhile, said nothing. To anyone. Even his dive team didn't know. To them, he was just Captain Cold, always quiet, always focused. No one guessed that every bolt he tightened and every gauge he checked was Ethan resisting the urge to fly home and burn it all down himself. Danielle thought she'd erased him. What she didn't know was that Ethan Blake had spent 19 years surviving the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Crushing depth, black waters, zero margin for error. He'd been trained to breathe under pressure, to stay calm, while everything around him was collapsing. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a reset. And by the time he surfaced for good, Ethan wasn't just going to reclaim what was his. He was going to rewrite the ending she thought she'd stolen.
Ethan landed in Houston under a name no one knew, stepped off the red-eye flight with nothing but a duffel and a burner phone. No announcement, no airport pickup. Just the sound of wheels on tile and the quiet hiss of a cab door opening. He didn't go home. He went 3 blocks past it, to an Airbnb Simon had reserved under a fake name. From its second-floor window, Ethan could see his old front porch. New potted plants lined the railings. A string of fairy lights blinked lazily in the night. Inside, a party. Laughter spilled into the street. The front door swung open again and again as guests arrived, young, well-dressed, unaware they were celebrating inside a home built on betrayal. Lucas Crane, in a tailored shirt, stood where Ethan used to park his truck, handing out drinks from Ethan's own bourbon collection. Danielle wore a white jumpsuit. Ethan's blood pressure spiked at the sight. Posing for selfies with Lucas in front of the fireplace he had personally rebuilt stone by stone during a cold winter 7 years ago. He watched without blinking, without feeling. And then he turned away and got to work. The next morning, Ethan met Simon and Brendan in a law office downtown. His new attorney, Laura Tiernan, didn't smile. She was sharp, soft-spoken, and carried a quiet reputation for eviscerating liars in court. She opened a folder. "This," she said, tapping the first page, is the corporate registration for a company called Aurora Core Wellness. Danielle listed herself as sole officer. Registered address, your marital home. Simon slid a spreadsheet across the table. $370,000 moved through that LLC in the past 11 months, mostly disguised as vendor payments. Half to Lucas's shell company, the rest to an offshore account under her maiden name. Laura continued. This wasn't just siphoning funds. It's premeditated fraud, layered through multiple fronts. We have enough for asset freeze, a court injunction, and criminal inquiry if we choose. Ethan didn't blink. She changed the insurance, too. Laura nodded. Yes, 6 months ago. Made Lucas the beneficiary on your $2 million life insurance. She forged the paperwork using a notary who's already under investigation in 3 other fraud cases. Simon leaned forward. And it gets worse. He dropped a grainy photo on the table. A balding man in khakis, mid-50s, leaning on a beat-up Toyota parked across from a dive control station. This is Marty Fallon, licensed PI out of Lubbock. Danielle hired him to monitor offshore assets, but he's been tracking your dive rotations for 3 months, even posed as an inspector on one of the safety boats. If he'd gotten you alone... Silence. Ethan inhaled slowly. She was planning more than a party. She was planning an exit. A permanent one, if it came to that. They didn't go to the police, not yet. Instead, they moved with surgical precision. Laura filed emergency motions in 2 counties. By midday, 3 of Danielle's accounts were frozen. Simon's team filed fraud alerts with the banks. Brendan flagged irregular tax filings with the IRS using data from Danielle's company. Everything done legally, quietly. At 3 p.m., a courier delivered the first subpoena to Lucas's tech startup office, a WeWork address with no real staff. An hour later, Ethan watched from across the street as Danielle's phone lit up. She left the party early, pacing on the front lawn. By evening, she'd made 8 phone calls in a panic. None of them were to Ethan. And that's exactly how he wanted it. The next day, Ethan walked into a private notary office with Thomas, their private investigator, carrying a briefcase full of evidence. Notarized statements, video footage, sworn affidavits from the bank manager confirming Danielle attempted to impersonate Ethan during a transfer. He wasn't fighting with fists. He was fighting with facts. He was building a case of methodical betrayal, paper trail by paper trail. And behind every document was a consequence Danielle hadn't anticipated. She thought Ethan would react with rage, but he didn't want revenge. He wanted a verdict. And with every passing day, it became clearer. He wasn't just going to win. He was going to bury her schemes so deep, no one would believe it had ever almost worked. It was the last Friday of the month. Inside Harris County Courthouse, courtroom 9B buzzed with quiet chatter. The morning docket was filled with routine motions: custody modifications, property splits, restraining orders. Danielle sat 3 rows from the front, dressed in an ivory blazer, pretending confidence. Lucas was at her side, fingers tapping the bench, eyes scanning the crowd. They had no idea Ethan was already in the building. He stood behind a tinted window in an adjacent chamber, with Laura and Brendan, watching as the bailiff called Harrington v. Harrington. Danielle rose, smoothing her blazer. Lucas gave her a reassuring squeeze. Laura turned to Ethan. Showtime. Danielle's attorney, a slick man with gelled hair and a Mont Blanc pen, opened with practiced concern. Your Honor, my client seeks immediate transfer of the marital home, citing abandonment, emotional hardship, and the need for housing continuity. Mr. Harrington has failed to respond to multiple filings and is currently unreachable on offshore assignment. The judge, A no-nonsense woman named Judge Rosario frowned. "Is the respondent present today?" "I believe not, Your Honor," the lawyer said with a smile. Then the courtroom doors opened. Heels clicked, papers rustled, and the silence that followed was thick enough to slice. Ethan entered in a black suit, flanked by Laura and a court officer. He didn't look at Danielle, didn't glance at Lucas, just walked straight to the respondent's table and placed a folder down with surgical calm. Judge Rosario looked over her glasses. "Mr. Harrington." "Yes, Your Honor. I apologize for the late arrival. I was out of state. Until now." Danielle's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Lucas's fingers twitched. Laura stood. "Your Honor, we are requesting dismissal of the petitioner's request on grounds of material fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to defraud a federal contractor. Supporting evidence has been filed under seal as Exhibit A through J." She walked forward and handed over a thick binder. "We also request an immediate asset freeze and criminal referral to the district attorney." The judge blinked. "On what grounds?" Exhibit B details forged bank authorizations. Exhibit D outlines the forged real estate listing agreement, and Exhibit G contains communications referencing a possible life insurance fraud plot. We have location data, text transcripts, and financial records, all verified. The judge's gaze darkened as she flipped through the first few pages. Then she looked directly at Danielle. "Mrs. Harrington, were you aware of these filings?" Danielle looked like a deer on a freeway. Your Honor, I thought he was still on the rig. This is all a misunderstanding." Ethan spoke, his voice steady. "She emptied our joint account, forged my signature to take out a loan, attempted to sell our home without consent, and planned to disappear with a man who has a history of doing this to other women." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Danielle's lawyer stood abruptly. "We request a continuance. This is highly irregular." Judge Rosario cut him off. "You had Mr. Harrington declared unreachable. You petitioned this court under claims of abandonment and emotional hardship, but your client was simultaneously liquidating assets, coordinating transfers to an offshore account, and living with another man in the marital residence." She turned to the court officer. "Secure the room. No one leaves." Lucas looked like he wanted to vanish into his chair. Within 30 minutes, the hearing transformed from a routine divorce motion to a federal investigation briefing. Laura laid out the timeline. 14 months of slow, deliberate fraud. Ethan's income diverted. Life insurance altered. PI hired. Real estate listing forged. Text messages referencing Plan B. The judge read the messages aloud. "Tell him there's an emergency with your mom. We need that money before the house closing. Plan B is just insurance money. People have accidents all the time." The judge looked up. "Mrs. Harrington, did you write these?" Danielle was silent. Lucas slowly slid to the end of the bench. "Answer the court," the judge snapped. I didn't mean it like that. It was just a joke," she whispered. "This court does not joke about premeditated insurance fraud. Motion for asset transfer is denied. Emergency freeze on all joint accounts is granted. Additionally, I'm referring this entire matter to the Harris County District Attorney." She slammed her gavel once. Court was adjourned. Danielle turned to Ethan as he stood to leave. "Wait, please, we can talk about this." But he was already walking. He had nothing left to say.
6 months after the courtroom storm, Ethan found peace, not in triumph, but in stillness. He'd left Houston behind and resettled in the quiet of Oregon's coastal hills, a modest cabin nestled among towering cedars with the Pacific Ocean visible through the treetops. The air was damp, salted with waves and silence, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Ethan was alone by choice, not abandoned. Every morning began with coffee on the porch and the low hum of the tide rolling in. No more alarms, no more satellite calls from an oil rig. Just the rhythm of the ocean and the chance to breathe. He didn't buy another mansion, didn't flash the settlement. Instead, he bought gear for a local diving school, took on a part-time role mentoring young students who wanted to learn underwater welding, deep-sea operations, and how to stay calm under pressure, skills that had once kept Ethan alive 300 feet beneath the Gulf. They called him Captain Steele. He never corrected them. One of the students, a 17-year-old named Luca, reminded Ethan of himself. Steady hands, quiet eyes, and a hunger to prove something. Ethan noticed, so he created the Harrington Resilience Fund, a scholarship in his late father's name. Not for the perfect student, not for the valedictorian, for the one who'd been through hell and showed up anyway. In his cabin, the walls weren't lined with photographs of court victories or revenge headlines. Instead, there were maps of coastlines, sketches of old oil rigs, and a photo of his dad from 1982, grinning in a hard hat with a wrench slung over his shoulder. One afternoon, while sorting through mail, Ethan paused over a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single note on lined paper, written in familiar feminine cursive. "I was wrong. You were the better one." No name, no apology, just 7 words. It was postmarked from a women's correctional facility in Tulsa. Ethan folded it once, placed it in the drawer beside his father's photo, and went for a walk along the ridge. He didn't feel victory, didn't even feel anger anymore. Just closure. Danielle had taken nearly everything, money, memories, trust, and tried to bury him beneath it. But in doing so, she had unwittingly carved the path to his rebirth. He had survived the deepest betrayal, not with rage, but with resolve. And in the wreckage, he had found something he didn't know he was missing. Himself. Not the provider, not the husband, just Ethan. Builder, teacher, diver, man. One evening, while helping Luca calibrate underwater gauges, the teen asked, "How'd you get so good at staying calm under pressure?" Ethan smiled, wiping engine grease from his palms. "Pressure doesn't change who you are. It just shows everyone what's underneath." Luca nodded thoughtfully, as if committing that truth to memory. Later that night, back on the porch, Ethan looked at the stars stitched above the sea and whispered one last thing to the wind. "Thank you for breaking me just enough to rebuild." He never needed another courtroom. He never needed Danielle's remorse. He had his breath, his backbone, and his name. And that was enough.
Ethan's story didn't end in a courtroom or with a final confrontation. It ended where all true healing begins, within. After losing nearly everything he thought defined him, his marriage, his home, his savings, Ethan discovered that the things most worth keeping are the ones no one can take. Integrity, experience, and the will to start over. Each betrayal, Each lie had threatened to break him, but instead they revealed his quiet strength. From the rig's deafening silence to the courtroom's tense stillness, Ethan held his ground with grace, not rage. He didn't scream, didn't chase vengeance, and yet he emerged with his dignity intact and a legacy of quiet power. He could have stayed bitter. He could have spent years trying to prove someone wrong, but instead he built something better, something his ex-wife would never understand, because it wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about proving to himself that his life had value beyond what she tried to define. And that's the truth so many of us forget. Being betrayed does not make you weak. Choosing to rebuild anyway, that's what makes you unstoppable. In teaching Luca, in starting his scholarship fund, in watching the tide come in every morning, Ethan didn't just survive betrayal, he transformed it. So, if you've ever been used, betrayed, or cast aside, let this story be your reminder. You are not what they took from you. You are what you decide to become after the storm. Have you ever experienced a moment that redefined your strength? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your story. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories of resilience, redemption, and quiet victories.